All right. Good evening or good morning, perhaps it is for you. Good afternoon, whatever it is, wherever you are watching us. You are watching Chuck and Brock. I'm Chuck, and Brock is with me as well. And we talk about generous theology. And specifically, we've been spending our time working through Herman Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics. And there are some people who think, well, dogmatics, that doesn't sound all that generous, but that's really what we're trying to do is, first of all, show that Bavinck's own system of dogmatics is a very generous one. His way of writing was very generous. And also for us to try to be generous in sort of explaining these things and trying to understand them from our perspective. Brock, I think last week I had, or maybe it was a couple of weeks ago, I had sent you an AI tool that somebody had showed me, and I had plugged in one of our videos into that AI, and it described us as two theologians. Well, the AI got it wrong. I know you've got some seminary under your belt, so maybe you count as a theologian, but I certainly don't count as any kind of a theologian. But what we are is just regular dudes, I guess, who really like theology and like philosophy, and have been especially impacted by Herman Bavinck and his theology. And so we just want to talk about it from our perspective, as we're just regular guys who are, reading what he has to say and sort of applying what we know. And in your case, you do have some theological background, some philosophy background, some work in apologetics. And in my case, well, I do a little bit of preaching, but my primary background is in law. And so, from that perspective, we kind of talk about things. So today, we are on our second opportunity to work through Bavinck's chapter on the Trinity. And last week, we started with chapter 6 of volume 2, the Holy Trinity. And we started in a section called Old Testament Seeds, but we didn't really get very far, Brock. we ended up talking about a lot of really cool and really neat things, and didn't even get to all the things we thought we might talk about sort of in preparation for looking at the Old Testament. And so that's what we're going to do again today. We're going to talk about those Old Testament seeds, and perhaps we'll get into some things about intertestamental Judaism, and if we get to the New Testament, we do. Otherwise, we'll do that in future discussions. But before we start that, Brock, last week we never got to this, and I was really intrigued by it. You had sent me, when we were sort of preparing for our discussion, you had sent me a link with a painting, an icon that was created by a Russian artist back in the 15th century, a painting entitled The Trinity. And I think probably you'll be able to get a photo of that on here as we're talking about it. But it is a fairly well-known painting. I think others may recognize it if they've seen it. My own pastor has a painting of this in his office at the church, and so it is something that I think is fairly familiar. But what's really interesting about it is that it's entitled The Trinity, but it comes from actually an Old Testament story. And so, Brock, I'm going to kind of turn it over to you here, because I know when you had sent me a photo of that painting, I knew there were things that you kind of wanted to talk about related to that icon, to that painting by Andrei Rublev. And I'd be interested in just sort of, why did you send me that link, first of all, which was really cool, and why should the people who are watching or listening to us care about this painting in our discussion about the Trinity? Really interested in hearing a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, my friend, for asking about that. It's actually a new image for me, and I was really, it really came into focus as one of the most important seeds of the Old Testament that possibly anticipates the Trinity. So, as you and I discussed last time, we are walking through two fields when we talk about the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. We're walking through the minefield, and we're walking through the cow field or the cow pasture. And that's because in both types of fields, you can step on something very unpleasant. And we're going to walk that as best we can here. So for those people who are really seeking to find something heretical in the way we talk about the Holy Trinity, I want to ask you to maybe push back on that a little bit. We seek a thoroughly orthodox position in our investigations, but at the same time, when we talk about this topic, we're going to talk about so much and so many different dimensions of what could have been in the hearing of the different views of what people throughout history have thought. And on top of that, we're going to talk about development within the church. So with respect to this painting and this image, which first of all, showing this image can get people in trouble in the Reformed world because of the prohibition against showing images that many have. Many in our tribe, the Reformed world, consider any image of Christ or any image of God at all to be a violation of the second commandment. Thou shalt not make images, any graven image in worship. So we post this. First of all, this image comes to us from outside of our tribe, but it has such interesting implications for the Old Testament seeds. We talked about the royal we last time, the intensification of the singular yet plural language referring to God in Genesis chapter 1. Just a few chapters over, Genesis chapter 18, we are going to see something else that is very interesting, and it relates to this image. So let me set the stage. This image is a painting. It's an image from the story of Genesis chapter 18, which is the appearance of God to Abraham near the oak grove of Mamre. So I'm going to read from this chapter, Genesis 18, and with this image in mind, and see if something hints at you with respect to the seeds of a Trinitarianism in the way this passage comes to the reader. We'll start at verse 1. It says, "The Lord appeared again to Abraham near the oak grove belonging to Mamre." Notice the singularity of that opening in verse 1. The Lord appeared again to Abraham. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent during the hottest part of the day. He looked up and noticed 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran to meet them and welcomed them, bowing low to the ground. "My Lord," he said, "if it pleases you, stop here for a while. Rest in the shade of this tree while water is brought to wash your feet. And since you have honored your servant with this visit, let me prepare some food to refresh you before you continue on your journey. So, Chuck, we're going to read more, but this painting by Rublev gives us an image of three persons, and you can see the medieval halo surrounding each of them. And Rublev paints this in his mind, putting the pieces together, that each of these three men are perhaps persons of the Holy Trinity. And we've got some tantalizing indications here. So again, as I mentioned, verse 1, the Lord appeared again to Abraham. So he's introduced in the singular. And then in verse 2, he notices three men standing nearby. So now we've got one, but now we're introduced to three. And then in the very next verse, he says, my Lord, in the singular. If it pleases you, stop here for a while. So, Chuck, this is none of us are suggesting that this is a conclusive demonstration of the Trinity. But yet, as we continue to read this passage, the interplay in this textual account and the way that the text sometimes gives us this singular view of the visitation, and yet we see that there are these three persons involved, really sets the stage. So I want to continue more with this, Chuck. But before I do, what do you think about this painting from Rublev in the light of this opening to Genesis chapter 18?
So yeah, it is it is really interesting to think about this image and juxtapose it with the text from Genesis 18. And I think we have to be, as you had said last week, we have to be a little careful about trying to find things where maybe they aren't. But I think there's some there, shall we say? So you've got these three visitors. And you've got the Lord appearing to Abraham, that first verse. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, and then Abraham looking up and seeing three men standing nearby. Now, is that enough to conclusively state, well, there we go, we got the Trinity, all done? Anybody who doesn't believe in the Trinity, just wrong. No, probably not. But one of the neat things about the Old Testament is that it's got these sort of shadows of what's going to come, right? And in the New Testament, we sort of pick up on those shadows, and they become easier to see. But even in the New Testament, as we'll talk about later, the word Trinity at least never appears, even if we would argue that the concept does. But I think what we see here is another hint, just as the royal we perhaps is a hint that there's something going on here. And so it is then interesting to look at this icon, and as you've identified, within our Reformed tradition, there are those who would say that any images of God and any images of Christ would be a second commandment violation. And even though these are the three, in some ways, these are just the three men who appeared at the trees at Mamre. Well, it was God who appeared, regardless of whether you interpret this as something about the Trinity. I understand that those who take a very restrictive view of the second commandment would have some concern with this. But what's really interesting here is even to think about the second commandment in light of what we have here in Scripture. The Scripture is in some ways using words painting us an image. We have to think about depending on how we take the second commandment and what exactly that means, Westminster Confession is pretty strong, that any sort of picture of Christ, any even thinking of images of Christ is a violation of the second commandment. The three forms of unity are perhaps not quite so strict on that issue. But even just thinking about whether this is a violation of the second commandment is sort of gets into these issues about, well, what is the Trinity? How do we understand it? Can we use images to help us to understand what is the Trinity? Do we run into problems? Even, you've probably seen sort of the symbolic representations that have been used. My own denomination has as its symbol a triangle with a cross through it. That is the symbol of the Christian Reformed Church in North America. Is that somehow a second commandment violation because we've got the triangle symbolizing the Trinity, the cross symbolizing Christ, putting that all together to sort of express who God is? I don't think it is. I guess if I thought it was, I probably would have left the Christian Reformed Church since they chose that logo. But it is really interesting to think about how do we understand those things, because here's the thing. As you pointed out, there are a lot of pitfalls in thinking about the Trinity, and there's a lot of places where we can fall into either non-orthodoxy, heterodoxy, or there are places where we can sort of stumble into just sort of misapprehensions and misunderstandings. And so we have to think about what's the best way to sort of present this idea of the Trinity. And I think this is kind of where I'm headed with this, and I know there will be some who disagree with me on this. I think part of why we have texts like the story in Genesis 18, and there's more to it, right? There's the whole gospel narrative here as well, and we can't sort of set that aside. But I think some of the imagery that is used there is designed to help us to understand. And now, should we take it so far as to then have icons like this and be venerating them as the Orthodox do? No, I think that's beyond the pale. I probably wouldn't put images like this on stained glass windows in my church. It's a little, and churches who do that, I'm not gonna sit in judgment and say, oh, you're outside the pale here, but I probably wouldn't do it if I'm designing my own church. But using this as a reminder to us of the gospel narrative and the narrative of the Trinity and how that all works, as a way of focusing ourselves not on sort of images of Christ or images of God so that we can worship those images, but rather focusing on how do we know the Trinity and what is the role of the Trinity in the gospel narrative that begins already in the Old Testament. I think there is a place for that kind of thing. And so, my pastor having this image in his office where he can see it, and it's a reminder to him that as he's writing sermons, as he's preparing to preach, that his task as a preacher is to preach the whole counsel of the gospel. And that includes that gospel of good news, and the Trinity is tied up in that. And in Reformed concepts of worship as well, where we often talk very much about how the Trinity is Trinitarian worship is very much at the center of how Reformed folks do worship. And so it's also a reminder for him of that Trinitarian nature of worship, and how he puts together a service is often reflects that. And so I think it is one of those things that is useful for that purpose. Now, Yes. Can people take it too far? Yes, they can, and I think we've seen that. Um, you know, and Brock, I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm going a little bit far afield, but it was really interesting to me after you showed me the image, and I recognized it last week. I did read through the Wikipedia page on this painting, on this icon, and it has a really fascinating backstory. The history from when it was painted, and then because it was used as an icon, it got this covering, and the covering sort of covered up much of the painting and just left portions of it available. But then that caused a little bit of damage to the work, and so then there were questions about how do you repair it, and what should be done, and is the metal covering removed, and what did they do to restore it, and all those things is also really fascinating, and again also gets into a little bit of, well, what is the purpose of this, and again for Russian Orthodox folks, that they've moved to a little bit more of a they'll often genuflect before icons. It becomes perhaps more, they're not worshiping the paintings. That goes way too far. That's not really what's happening. But the sort of the experience of that as part of the worship, goes a little bit further than we as Reformed folks would be willing to do. But again, it's just really interesting to think about this, the Trinity, and how this concept of the Trinity is important to the Orthodox, and this was placed in a Trinity church that burned down, and so when they created this new stone Trinity Cathedral, this is when the painting is actually done, and it's designed to sort of make sure that we understand this concept of the Trinity. So yeah, it's really an interesting story, and if people who are interested in it, if you look up Trinity, Andrei Rublev, Rublev, on Wikipedia, and maybe you want to dig further into some other places, but it's a really interesting article that sort of gets into a lot of that discussion. So Brock, I want to thank you for sort of reminding me of this and allowing me to think through it. Is there more that you wanted to sort of cover on that on that painting, and how we might as Reformed folks engage with a painting like this as we think about the doctrine of the Trinity?
Yeah, my friend, there is. I want to continue reading from this chapter, and the way I left off the reading of the chapter might indicate something more than we're trying to say here. And so I'm going to take a moment to clarify that. But first, this idea of Rublev. To be honest with you, as a student of the scriptures for 40 plus years, I had myself not made this connection in Genesis chapter 18. It's really with seeing that portrait from Rublev and reading about it in a Trinitarian Dogmatics book that really came to me, and I was struck by that. But having said so, I don't want people to think that we're taking some joy in showing a second commandment violation image to just be controversial. So that's not the case. However, the treatment brought out such interesting aspects of this text, and I want to just continue in Genesis chapter 18 with that. So the three men are having a conversation over the food that has been prepared for them. Abraham has prepared a meal, and Abraham is serving them. Hospitality is important here, and Abraham is waiting on them in the shade of the trees. Now, Abraham is the master of this little area. He's the Lord of the house. Sarah even calls her husband a master. So Abraham is not a waiter by profession, but something about these three men is very important. And someone could argue reasonably that this was part of the hospitality culture. And I get that. But so Abraham is waiting on these men, and they are feeding, and one of the visitors asks in verse 9, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abraham replies, "Inside the tent." And then one of them says, "I will return to you about this time next year, and your wife, Sarah, will have a son." Now, earlier in Genesis, the son is promised to Abraham, but it is God who makes that promise. And now we have one of these three men. First of all, one of them is asking, "Where is your wife?" But then we have another one of them saying, "I will return to you. And by this time next year, your wife, Sarah, will have a son." That is awfully personal, as if that person speaking is the one in communication with Abraham who's made the promise. So had it been, for example, as some people say, that these three visitors were simply angelic beings, messengers. If we look at how messengers elsewhere in the scriptures, the angel Michael or the angel Gabriel or some other being sent on behalf of God to deliver a message to a person, we see in other places, we see them acting as heralds. I come with a message from the Lord. I am his herald. This is me. But we don't have that here in this chapter 18. We have one of these three men saying, "I will return to you this time next year, and there will be a son." And this is, of course, the famous passage where Sarah laughs silently to herself. Now she's listening to the conversation from the tent. She laughs silently to herself, the text says. And she says, as an aside, "How could a woman like me enjoy such a pleasure?" And then verse 13 says, "Then the Lord said to Abraham." Why did Sarah laugh? Why did she say, "Can an old woman like me have a baby? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Then here it is. "I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." So, if we're looking to explain this passage, one potentiality is that these are three angelic messengers and not the three persons of the Trinity. And the Spirit of God in an immaterial form is also present. But now we have this portion of the conversation developing where one of them asks, "Where is Sarah?" The other one says, "I will return, and there will be a son." And then Sarah responds off stage, as it were, in a manner that presumably is not affecting the table talk. And yet the Lord hears. And it is said in verse 13, the Lord said. And then we have this speech from the Lord attributed, I will return. Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return. Sarah will have a son. And that is very interesting. Others have concluded, Bavinck notes, like John Calvin, for example, that one of the three angelic beings is the divine Logos, the second person of the Trinity, who will be incarnated in the flesh as Jesus, the Christ. And so this would be an example of a theophany, of this special and unique appearance of God participating in his universe. And then the other two angels are part of the retinue brought along. And I think there's still another idea from Augustine that Professor Bavinck cites. It says these three men are created angels, and God is revealing himself through these three angels in a special way. So this is, I agree, this is a very special way. Now it goes like this. Here's how the meal concludes. Verse 16. Then the men got up from their meal and looked out towards Sodom. As they left, Abraham went with them to send them on their way. Now, here it comes. The Lord asks, should I hide my plan from Abraham? And then in verse 20, it says this, the Lord told Abraham, I have heard a great outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah, because their sin is so flagrant. Verse 22 says this way, the other men turned and headed towards Sodom, but the Lord remained with Abraham. So Chuck, we have enough clues to be very interested. And yet we also have an ambiguity in the text, where the text doesn't hit us over the head with the Trinity. It doesn't put us in a place to where the only way to think about this text and talk about this text is in a Trinitarian manner. But, you know, as far as Old Testament seeds, what a beautiful seed this is. Chuck, how about that second part there and the interaction between God and man? What a personal interaction it is.
You know, yeah, and I think that's one of the points here, right? The personality of this contact, whether this is the Logos, whether this is Christ prior to his becoming a human, appearing and speaking with Abraham, whether it is some kind of uncreated angel, or, you know, in other words, a form of God, or whether it's a created angel that through whom God mediates, it is, regardless of whether you take any one of those positions, there is something very personal about the contact. And that's also, again, a reminder of the gospel, right? Because the gospel, while the gospel certainly has aspects that are much larger than the individual, that there's a community aspect, there's the church aspect, there's the whole world, you know, the creation of the whole universe, for God so loved the world, that aspect of it. But there is also very much an individual aspect of the gospel to the individual believer. And this text is one of many texts that really drives that home, that this is contact that a human being is able to have with God, and it happens as part of God's plan of salvation. And the fact that Abraham, who was certainly a key part of that plan of salvation, but he was a human being, that he could have that experience of having personal contact with God. Later, Moses is able to have that kind of contact. Later, others as well in the Old Testament, Samuel hearing the voice of God, those kinds of things, is a reminder to us of the personal nature of the gospel, and that God is reaching out to each and every one of us, even as individuals, and offering salvation to us as individuals, and offering to us the opportunity as individuals to become brothers with Christ, to become adopted brothers of Christ and children of God. And so in some ways, I think one of the things that Bavinck actually says as he talks about some of these different views, the views of Augustine and the views of some others, including Luther and Calvin, he says the difference between the two interpretations is not as big as it seems. On the one hand, the proponents of the view of the ancient church have to admit that the Logos assumed a human form. On the other hand, Augustine and his followers have to grant that in that created angel, the Logos revealed himself in an utterly unique way. And what Bavinck is saying here, I think in some ways is like, pick a side. Go ahead, pick a side. It's okay. Because whichever side you pick, there are going to be some really smart people who agree with you and some really smart people who totally disagree with you. But go ahead, pick a side, because that's not what matters here. What matters, this is not a text primarily about, okay, let's figure out does the Trinity mean this? What is the, that's not the purpose here. The purpose of this text is to, again, be a part of that story of the gospel. And Abraham, the promise to Abraham, which is a promise to all of God's people. And it was through Abraham that happened. It's through Abraham that you and I, as individuals, Brock, are able to be saved. It's through that promise that God made to Abraham that Abraham would have many children, among whom would be this human, Jesus Christ, fully human, also fully divine. It would be through Abraham's descendants, the Jews, that this would take place, but it applies to all who have faith and all who believe, and individually it applies to us. And so we may not have, experiences like this where God, whether it's him specifically or whether it's through the mediation of an angel, comes to us and speaks to us about our salvation, but we are very much individually in this gospel story. I'm reminded of something I read. A pastor who is part of an organization that sort of teaches pastors how to preach, and so he will often do commentaries on the texts that are commonly being read for that day. He'll go through the lectionary texts. And I remember one time his talking about an Old Testament text, and the story of the gospel as it came through that. And it reminded him of when he was just a very small child, and he didn't understand exactly what was going on in this story. The story that he was being told, and it wasn't this particular story, but it was another Old Testament story that really dealt with God appearing to his people. And he said that his mother said to him, "Hey, this story is about you. You are actually in the Bible, you little Timmy," or whatever his name. I can't think of the name off the top of my head. But you little Timmy, you little Chucky, you little Brocky, you are in the Bible. You were there. You are part of that narrative. And this is a story that helps us to see that. And is it Jesus who's there? Is it Logos? Is it God specifically? Well, there's some evidence of that. Is it perhaps mediated through an angel? Well, maybe there's some evidence for that, there's the whole thing that no one could see God because he's so amazing and so brilliant that it has to be mediated in some way, and so that's why some people might take that position. But that's not the point. The point is that we are part of that gospel story, and that gospel message is meant for each and every one of us as individuals, and that's an amazing message.
In the midst of that beautiful passage, there are other Old Testament seeds. I think one of the ones that was extremely important for me. So Professor Bavinck starts to talk about in the next section the intertestamental Judaism section about some of the apocryphal writings and how they develop ideas that were floating in the culture in that time. And I think one of the there's an important passage that Professor Bavinck's talking about here. I think, let me make sure I get it right. I think it's the Book of Wisdom. There's also Ecclesiasticus mentioned, these apocryphal writings outside of our canon that speak about and give hints along these lines. I think one of the ways in which I was struck even as a young believer, being aware of the Trinity, but not being studied very greatly into it, is I was very provoked by Proverbs chapter 8 and the description there. So this is long before theological training. This is long before a seminary class. This is me as a young boy, perhaps in my early teens, reading this passage. And Proverbs 8 starts off like this: wisdom calls for a hearing. Verse 1 says, listen as wisdom calls out. Hear as understanding raises her voice. On the hilltop along the road, she takes her stand at the crossroads. By the gates at the entrance to the town, on the road leading in, she cries aloud, I call to you, to all of you. I raise my voice to all people. You simple people, use good judgment. You foolish people, show some understanding. Listen to me, for I have important things to tell you. Everything I say is right, for I speak the truth, and detest every kind of deception. My advice is wholesome. There is nothing devious or crooked in it. My words are plain to anyone with understanding, clear to those with knowledge. Choose my instruction rather than silver, and knowledge rather than pure gold. For wisdom is far more valuable than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with it. And so we're introduced to this personification. Principles don't speak. Irony doesn't speak. Wisdom as an abstract, disembodied entity doesn't speak. What would be another principle? Virtue, beauty doesn't speak in this abstract way, but we have in the scriptures wisdom speaking in a personalized sense. And then we have this beautiful follow-up. I love all who love me, and those who search will surely find me. And then here it comes. The passage that made my jaw drop as a young boy. Verse 22, the Lord formed me from the beginning, before he created anything else. I was appointed in ages past, at the very first, before the earth began. I was born before the oceans were created, before the springs bubbled forth their waters, before the mountains were formed, before the hills I was born, before he had made the earth and fields and the first handfuls of soil. I was there when he established the heavens, when he drew the horizon on the oceans. I was there when he set the clouds above, when he established springs deep in the earth. I was there when he set the limits of the seas so they would not spread beyond their boundaries. And when he marked off earth's foundations, I was the architect at his side. I was his constant delight, rejoicing always in his presence. And how happy I was with the world he created. How I rejoiced with the human family. So, Chuck, there's an ambiguity here to this passage, as there is in the Genesis 18 passage. Some people, as a young boy, my first thought was that Proverbs 8, the personification of wisdom, was the Christ. Now, with the Lord's help, more careful reading over decades, I now believe that this is personifying the wisdom that was with Christ as he does all of these things described in this chapter, as opposed to it being directly speaking of Jesus himself. But having said that, there's that ambiguity there, and we see, again, that whatever Christianity is, it has a personal God. There is no, we're going to see in the intertestamental period, we're going to see Judaism turning towards some of the other directions. And so when I say Judaism here, I mean something like the rabbinical forms of Judaism, something like the Gnostic forms of Judaism that are present in the Mediterranean region in the intertestamental period. And those tend to actually sound quite different from this personalized humanized God who we encounter. You tend to hear things about the absolute, the unutterable, the one who cannot be named. And right here in the scriptures, we don't necessarily get a name like Jack or Andy or Ralph, but we do get this overwhelming personal sense. And I think, to me, Chuck, that's one of the most beautiful readings in all of the scriptures. When you see passages like that, how has it taken you? How has your studies been impacted by it? And where do you think people trying to contemplate it where should they go, and what are the things they should be taking special care to notice in these passages?
Yeah, so I think there's one other piece here that I think people do need to notice about these texts and how they speak about God. And Bavinck actually points this out really well. So building on what we've talked about before, and specifically on what you said, Bavinck talks about the Spirit and wisdom, and what's the connection there. He says the work of creation and providence is established not only by the word and wisdom of God, however, but also by his Spirit. There is a real tie between that wisdom, that word and wisdom, the logos and the wisdom, but also the Spirit. And Bavinck then says, whereas God calls all things into being by his word as a mediating agent, and that's, as a kid in grade school, we always learned about Jesus as the mediator. And so God calls all things into being by his word as mediating agent. The word was God and the word was with God. It is through his Spirit that he is immanent in the creation and vivifies and beautifies it all. So it's through his Spirit that he is actually very much present in his creation with us, God with us, just as Jesus was God with us, Emmanuel, when as a result of the incarnation, the Spirit is also God with us now, and beautifies and brings life to all of that creation. And then, besides the work of creation, there's the work of recreation, and Bavinck talks about that, and specifically again ties together the work of the three persons of the Trinity. There's the work of God the Father, but also of the Messiah Christ, and then the Spirit. Bavinck, in talking about this recreation, this recreative work of God, says the Spirit will rest in an unusual measure on the Messiah, but afterward be poured out on all flesh, on us individually, and give to all a new heart and a new spirit. So we receive this new heart and new spirit because of this vivifying, life-giving work of recreation by the Spirit. Bavinck says this threefold divine principle, which underlies creation as well as recreation and sustains the entire economy of Old Testament revelation, sometimes occurs in a single passage. And he points to some very specific passages that get into this and focuses on the threefold blessing. But what's really important here is to think about this work of the Trinity and how the work of the Spirit and of Logos and wisdom, how that all works together in terms of both creation, God's original work to create all that exists, including us as human beings, and also his work of recreation, of recreating it to be made new, to end the power of sin, to recreate us even as individuals, and allow the Spirit to also be poured out on each of us. So that's one other thing that I just picked up on this section in the Old Testament seeds, that already we see that in the Old Testament. We begin with the story of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, but already by Genesis 3, we're getting to that story of recreation, which is that story of the gospel, and how that story, how each of the persons of the Trinity is involved in that story, not only of creation, but also of recreation.
So, my friend, you speak beautifully there, and we, in examining this and thinking about what is happening in the Mediterranean world in this intertestamental period, we have, depending on how you want to count the years, 4 or 5 centuries in the Eastern Mediterranean that can best be described as not one thing. But even though not one thing is the right way to describe the history of the ideas, there are some major themes. We've looked at some of the Old Testament seeds, and you and I have both mentioned the personal nature of the hints that seem to be there in the text. This is important because one of the deviations to my thinking, to my studied impression of what happened in the intertestamental period, is much of Judaism fell away from the personalized being of the Old Testament scriptures and came into contact. So you have the fall of Old Testament Israel. You have the exile in Babylon. You have the Persian Empire conquering Babylon, taking over, sending the exiles back to their land. Now, as the exiles go back, there's an interesting thing here. If you recall, there were 2 kingdoms that went into exile and were destroyed. There was the kingdom of the north, Old Testament Israel. And what would happen is, after the destruction of that kingdom, the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, would continue for a little while longer before it also was destroyed. Now, when the exiles return, the northern kingdom had been conquered by the Assyrians, and one of the ways that the Assyrians would establish control and rule over a conquered territory is they would people swap. So they would take the people who lived in a territory they had just conquered, and they would take those people to another province and swap the population with people from that other province who would get resettled into the newly conquered territory. And so when the return from the exile happens in this intertestamental period, there are the northern kingdom is now populated by peoples from the Assyrian reassignment. And so these people are settled in the land of Israel. And many of them adopt the land. They become the people of that place, as opposed to the people who came from another place and are now settled here. Now, Chuck, this is not unheard of. My ancestors came to this country on my mother's side from Poland, not in a forced resettlement, of course. But so I have a special heart and affinity for Polish people. However, after several generations, I consider myself to be an American. And if I went back to Poland right now, I am certain that any relatives who are still there, and we believe that there are, we believe that we do have family there. We've lost touch, but we know we had them in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s when my grandparents were still alive. Anyway, today I am an American. And so too, when the exile is over and the Jewish people come back, and the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, comes along, and then after 100, 150 years or so, Greece comes along and conquers the Persian Empire. Alexander the Great does something that was astonishing for antiquity in that conquest. And so now you have, during this intertestamental period, the northern portion is largely populated by people who were called in the New Testament, we know them as Samaritans. You know the story of the Good Samaritan, and you know about the the enmity and there was a lot of racial and cultural hatred between the Samaritans and the Jewish people, who, when they returned from the exile, largely stayed centered in the older kingdom of Judah. So you have this. So you have Samaritans, many of whom adopt and come into their understanding. They become Jews in their minds, even though ethnically that's not their ethnic background. This becomes their land, and they care for it and they love it, and they have a patriotism for it. And yet you also have the Jewish people who are the descendants of the ethnic people who were conquered, and they come back in the land. And so you start to see this push and this pull. The Samaritans have different ideas about God that come into the culture and that affect their region. Even the relocated from the exile Jewish people are affected to some degree by their sojourn into exile in Babylon. They're not the same as the people who left the Old Testament Davidic kingdoms. And so during this intertestamental period, we see this great diversity of thought. And it is truly, I call it, Chuck, a mulligan stew. Now, I don't know if everybody has the same understanding of it, but in my growing up, a mulligan stew was nothing specific. It was a mishmash of everything. What tended to happen is all of your leftovers, if they still were salvageable, could go into the soup pot or the stew pot, and you would just create this mulligan stew, and it would be sort of whatever is sloshing around in the remnants of the kitchen there. And now you have that in this intertestamental period, Chuck. And so if people are looking for this pristine, pure line of thought, sort of running through, they're going to be very surprised at the diversity, I think, in general. But Chuck, as you yourself consider that history, and you've seen that it's happened, you know that even though so much has changed, you know that the scriptures themselves are still there. And what it comes down to in a lot of cases is, how do we value those scriptures? So if you're a first century Jewish person right before Christ, how do you value those scriptures? And the answer is the Jewish people and the Samaritans and their neighbors all had very diverse takes on that. And so that creates this complicated picture. Now, Chuck, without asking you to sort of solve all the issues of diversity in the culture in this time, what was it like for you reading about this part in the section in Bavinck, and sort of coming to terms with the fact that there is no one line, and people who are looking for the one true line are going to find it very difficult to trace in this turbulent time?
Yeah, absolutely. It is difficult to trace, and it sort of puts paid to the idea that the way to get to truth is just to simply follow the straight line, because there's not a straight line through that intertestamentary period. Now, what I'll say is this: in this particular section, there was a lot there, and a lot of it was a little beyond my knowledge. I'm certainly no expert on the intertestamentary period. I probably read a few of the apocryphal books as a kid, just because I remember that they existed in a couple of versions of the Bible that we had, the Jerusalem Bible being one of them. So, and I was just sort of interested in what was there, but understanding the purpose of it and what they were talking about was a little bit more difficult. And I haven't spent a lot of time since then and really focused on that period. However, there is one. I think there's one piece of information, or something that is meaningful here, which is then when we get into the New Testament, and I'm talking more generally, I'm not just talking about as we study the Trinity, but more generally, as we get into the New Testament, we see that Jesus, in speaking with the Jewish leaders, is really dealing with a plethora of different leaders. There's the Pharisees and the Sadducees. There are the chiefs and the high priests, and so there's this whole mishmash. And you can kind of put them into some categories. There's sort of the radicals as well. The people who maybe were the Essenes, and the people who ended up at Masada, and the people who saved the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that whole group. But there were all these various different groups to whom Jesus spoke, and over the years, I've come to realize, mostly through sitting through some excellent preaching, that when you listen to Christ's words, they are both universal in that his words in the New Testament are for all, but they're also directed at specific people at that time. And so we have this is kind of a side issue, not related to the Trinity, but one thing that I heard really, and I don't remember who gave this sermon. It may have been my current pastor, but it may have been somewhere else that I heard this sermon, where the discussion was, in today's world, we tend to think of the Pharisees as the absolute bad guys, right? We use terms like Pharisaical. Even people who have no idea who the Pharisees were in the Bible use that term to describe people who are sort of hypocritical about things, and maybe try to impose certain ways of doing things. Oh, that's Pharisaical. But what's really interesting is when you look at how Christ deals with the Pharisees. In many ways, he's the hardest on them, not because they're the worst, but because they're so close but don't quite have it. and there's a sense then that you see that, and then you see the way that he deals with the Sadducees, you see the way he deals with the high priests, and there's some, again, there's some universality there. The universality of the gospel is part of what's there, but it's also Christ is dealing with all these different through lines that don't all necessarily connect. And so there is, in that discussion of intertestamentary Judaism, I think, as I read through it, and I will readily admit I had a lot more highlighting in the Old Testament and the New Testament section than I did in this section, but it was a reminder to me of what comes next in the New Testament. And it's a reminder, and as you sort of so well put it, that the fact that there aren't these through lines, that there isn't a single pathway through. And in fact, many of the, let's be honest, if somebody did a 23andMe or an Ancestry.com on some of the people who were Jewish, they might actually find out that they weren't as Jewish as they thought that they were, because of how this all worked. But yet that's also, again, what's really, really cool about that is it's that story of the exile and the return not being exactly the same people. It sort of turns on its head the very ethnic view of Judaism that just says you're connected to God because you're a Jew, and brings in a much more full idea of what it means to be connected to God. So these people who were truly Jewish, right? But maybe their bloodlines also brought in these other folks. And then, as we know, as we study the Old Testament, we think of people like Rahab, right? Rahab wasn't Jewish, but then her, she's one of the ancestors of Christ. Ruth, the Moabitess is part of that story as well. And what it does is it reminds us that, yes, the Jews were God's chosen people. They were the people through whom the gospel was revealed, but it is a story to the whole world. And so Gentiles like you and I, you being at least part Polish, and my background is mostly Irish with some German and perhaps a few other things too that ancestry tells me about. That is a story. It's a story that's meant for us as well, even though at the time of the Jews, our ancestors were probably running around, with spears and, sort of barely barbarian, but it is a story that's for all nations. The gospel is for all nations. And so today there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, all those things that we're all one in Christ. And so that's an important piece here. And so I liked how you sort of point out that story during the intertestamentary period, because it does really bring that out. The other thing I just sort of mentioned is it was sort of interesting to me, given some of our discussions in the past, but when we were reading medieval philosophers, and how over the time during medieval times, there's sort of the early period where that's a little more tied to ancient philosophy, and some of those folks who had from ancient philosophy who had a great impact on later medieval philosophy. Their names turn up here. Philo, right? Is one of those. Aristotle shows up here. Stoic doctrines show up here, and so it is interesting. I have to say, I don't always think, when I think of Jesus dealing with, whether it's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers and the high priests, I don't always think about the fact that many of those, this was already a very Greek world that Christ came into. And so a lot, even though it was still also a very Hebrew world, he came specifically to Judea, but there is that impact of the Greek world on the way people were thinking then too. And so it is really interesting to see some of that. And then even, one of the things that Bavinck just briefly mentions is how there's an erasure of the boundary that in the Old Testament always separates the creature from the creator, that paves the way for the philosophy of Gnosticism and the Kabbalah. And one of the interesting things about that is, first of all, you and I have talked numerous times about the creator-creature distinction. It's a big part of what Bavinck is all about. And we've talked about how, to some extent, that distinction has been lost in modern philosophy in certain ways. But it was also a reminder to me, the Kabbalah has become sort of cool again, right? To a certain category, certain Hollywood folks and musicians. I know the singer Madonna is really into the Kabbalah. And well, what's interesting about that is that also ties through. We can see, actually, if people in our day and age are interested in the Kabbalah, which erases the distinction between creator and creature, we can actually see a tie, even though Madonna herself probably isn't thinking about how this is also related to modern philosophy. She thinks of herself as getting away from that and going to something very old, but yet there's a connection there as well. It perhaps ought to be not so surprising that whether it's New Age ideas, whether it's the Kabbalah and some of these trendy things that you see today, and also sort of that modernism of the 19th century and the postmodernism that's come since that time, they're connected. They're all interconnected, and they're interconnected in a way that separates themselves from Orthodox Christianity. And so it was a good reminder reading through this section of some of those things that we had talked about previously. It's not specifically tied to the concept of the Trinity, but it is, I think it was sort of a reminder of those things.
So that's such a good point, my friend. I think one of the big things that comes to me in reading this section, and I wanted to do more. I brought along a lot of material that just didn't get into this discussion episode for time constraints. Having said that, much of the postmodern attacks in the culture you and I are a part of today seem to sort of follow this revisionistic, secular retrospective. And the format and form tends to be you'll have quote unquote the secular expert. And I'm thinking here of atheist scholars like, for example, Dr. Bart Ehrman, among others. And they'll sort of lead with a gotcha. Did you know that there were many gospels besides the 4 that made it into the Bible? Why only these 4? Why not the Gospel of Thomas? Why not the Gospel of Judas? Why not the Gospel of Mo, Larry, and Curly? Now, that last part there, I'm being flippant, but there's this push on the part of much critical scholarship that seeks to come at Christianity as if the gospel came in the first century to a very simple-minded, backward people. And as Dr. Ehrman and others point out, in their for their secular purposes, nothing could be further from the truth. The gospel came. The Lord Jesus came, not to the most backwater place on the planet, but he came to philosophically, religiously, and politically one of the most advanced places of its day. You don't find the intellectual fecundity anywhere else in the world like you do in Jerusalem, in Alexandria, in Tarsus. There's just this amazing diversity that's there. And so the gospel message is not a simple message to a simple people in a vacuum. And now we've made so much progress that we can go back with our superior secular ways and deconstruct these simple-minded first century beliefs. No, it's the exact opposite. Jesus came to a sophisticated culture. Now, not everybody in a culture that is sophisticated at an individual level. But the point is, there's that depth there. And people who make simplistic arguments about Christianity not ever having to deal with very well-developed, sophisticated challenges, they're just not students of history. And so that was a beautiful thing to see in this section. And Chuck, there's so much more. I'm leaving a lot of stuff on the table here, but I know we have to wrap this up. Would you give us some final thoughts from your end, my friend, and maybe a closing prayer?
Yeah, so I think you've wrapped things up very well. I am looking forward the next time we get together to going through the New Testament and reading through what Bavinck has to say about this doctrine of the Trinity as it's found in the New Testament. I think, obviously, as we've said, there's a tie to the Old, but the New Testament, in many ways, reveals things that are still in shadows in the Old Testament. So I am very much looking forward to that. And then as we go forward, even thinking about sort of the history of and the development of the Trinitarian dogma. So, yeah. Why don't we close in prayer to our triune God? Let's pray. Our Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we confess that you are three in one God in three persons, and we praise you for your triune nature. As we pray to you, as we consider your works, as we consider the salvation that you've wrought, help us to focus on the things that you would have us to focus on. It's easy, I think, Lord, to sometimes want to spend so much time trying to understand every single little possible nuance of this doctrine of the Trinity, and that we lose the bigger picture, and that bigger picture being that you are the creator. You are the recreator, the redeemer, the sustainer of all things. You provide for our salvation, and as a result of that, we can live with you in this world. We can enjoy creation in a way that only those who are recreated, whose hearts have been recreated, whose hearts have been made new, can fully experience and enjoy creation and enjoy our fellowship with you. We praise you, O God, Father, Son, and Spirit. We pray this in the precious name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.